Okay, so now those two glazes are dry, we can add some more juicy colours. And one of the colours I'm going to use is quinacridone red, which is a lovely bright, almost like the inside of a strawberry colour. And we're going to put this on wet on dry. So you want to get a nice quantity of colour onto your brush. Just tap it on the tissue and drag it on very gently, just in the brighter areas of the apple. You can jump around, but don't do too much too quickly, because then you'll find it'll dry too quickly for you to soften. Just use the damp, clean brush around that just to soften it in. You can work as quickly or as slowly as you like on this stage. You can stop and come back to the painting at a later date, or you can carry on adding the colour, so long as you don't go over the same area twice too soon. So little by little, you're just bringing up the colour of that apple to a much brighter, shinier glaze. Just putting a little bit more around the side here and filling in around the highlights. I'm doing about 2 patches at a time, because that way I've got enough time just to sweep around the edges to soften them in. And I'm not making the whole apple wet, which means that I can work around the apple and come back to areas in between time. Smaller areas where you need to be very quick, just do one little piece at a time. That way you can soften it and meld it into the apple without getting any hard edges. If you get any little streaks or hard edges, just flatten the brush out and just sweep them away. Very gentle little sweep like that will just blend them into the apple. Very important that you keep an eye on the whole apple rather than just one area at a time. That way you can check if any areas are going to be problematic. Try and keep the colour away from your highlights, so you keep it nice and bright. I'm going to add a little bit of permanent rose into that quinacridone red, just a little stronger on the colour through the middle here. And then I'm going to go down to a smaller brush, soften that in. I'm going to pick up a number 4 sable brush with a fine point and go back to that second colour wash that I mixed, and we can see if we can start defining a little bit of detail in the centre of the apple. Start by defining the line where the apple curves away and into the centre, and then add a little bit of that dark colour in. Clean the brush, flatten it out, and just sweep that up towards the highlight, just softening that in very gently. Just do a small amount at a time. I'm going to mix a tiny little bit of green, a little bit of cadmium yellow pale, a little bit of Winsor blue green shade, and drag that in. There's a sort of dry greeny shade to the centre, and put a little bit either side of the stalk. So again, it's wet on dry, making sure that this line lines up both sides of the stalk, and then I'm going to use a little bit of the darker colour to put in the shadow from the stalk. It's a little bit red at the moment, but when it dries it'll be a little bit duller, and then I can just soften on some bluey colour to give it a shadowy appearance. Sweep that just with a clean brush up and over the top there for the shadow, and just soften it away because it disappears under the bright light. That's the 3rd stage done. While we're waiting for all those layers to dry, it's a good time just to mix up the colours for the stalk, so we'll just do that quickly. I'll try and use the primary colours as often as I can, so I'm going to use French ultramarine, cadmium yellow pale, and cadmium red deep. A little bit more blue. Those three colours mixed together make a lovely deep brown colour. You can mix them in different quantities and get all kinds of tertiary shades, but this is the brown that we're after. So I'm just going to very gently draw that in with the tip of the brush. If I just paint it on, keeping a nice sharp edge, then I can lift out the highlight very quickly before it dries. Be very careful, just use the tip of the brush. This is the number 4 still. Take it right the way down, this is the scary bit, right across the middle there so that it dips into the centre of the apple. Clean your brush, take the excess water out and just sweep away at the top for the lighter colour at the top of the stalk. Slightly more yellowy. Just add a little bit more cadmium yellow to your brown and just very gently drag in that brighter colour into the settling glaze. We can come back and put more detail on that in a little bit, but that's nice, that's caught that nicely. So while we're waiting for that to dry, I'm just going to use the second darker wash, mix up a little bit of that and just very carefully tidy up the edge of the apple here. It's a little bit of a raggedy edge. So keep the brush underneath the edge of the apple. Very carefully tidy that edge so it's nice and sharp. And then pull the colour back in towards the middle of the apple as carefully as you can, and then very quickly soften it in with a damp brush. That gives you an extra little bit of colour but also tidies that edge up, which is quite nice. If anywhere you've got double edges, you can just gently agitate the upper edge away and blend it into the lower one. So while we're on that colour, we can drop in some stronger colour here and there. So a little bit of darker colour through the middle. It's quite a lot of colour through the middle of this apple, so be aware that you're going to have to do more than the usual 3 glazes to get that colour up. Soften it in. A little bit more colour underneath here. So it's really started to get nice and dark. With watercolour it's quite tricky to get that depth of colour, but it is manageable. But I do tend to let a little bit more light into the painting just to give it a little bit more poetry, a little bit more paintability. So just keep an eye that you don't go too dark. Once you go too dark with your glaze, it's very difficult to get the light back again. So it's quite nice to just get a soft balance between the two. Each little layer of colour that I'm putting on, I'm just softening around the edge and maintaining those highlights. So the stalk should be dry enough now just to drop a little bit more colour and a little bit more texture through the top. So just using the tip of the brush here, we're going to put a little bit of texture through here. You can sort of seesaw the brush around just to get a little bit more texture and interest through there. Any little white marks that you've left, to remove those at this stage. And just sweep the brush over, get a little bit of texture coming over the top there. And soften that in as well, so that you get a nice gentle texture to it. So we'll let that dry because we want to come back and put a stronger shadow in there and a little bit more detail over the top. While we let that dry, we can think about what detail we want to put in the body of the apple. The washes are completely dry now, so we can come back on and put a little bit more colour on. I've taken a little bit of time to have a look, see where it needs to go, and I've mixed up a colour similar to before but added a little bit of yellow. So I'm going to put this wet on dry and put a little bit more colour along this far edge. Try and keep the brush right underneath that edge and get it as sharp as possible. There are no apples with fluffy edges. So put a little bit of colour on. Don't do too much this time because it's quite a strong colour and you want to be able to catch that edge and soften it in quite quickly. So just put it on there and sweep away. gently sweeping that in. Just make it a little bit darker with a bit of French ultramarine and put some more colour across the middle here. This will take the colour, it will actually all soak in. Because we're doing it all wet on wet, the colours are soaking in very gradually, and so there's not too much pigment sitting on top, so it will actually take quite a wet wash on top, which a lot of people are fearful of doing, but it does actually dry fairly permanently in between washes. And I'm putting it on very, very gently, just encouraging it to glaze very gently on top. A bit more colour through there and through there. Catching each edge with a clean brush. Sometimes I move the brush quickly, sometimes smoothly. It depends what sort of texture I'm hoping to put onto the edge. If I'm moving it quickly, it's because it's gathering into a textured area of the apple. If I'm moving it smoothly, it's because it's coming onto the disappearing edge and smoothing away around the corner. Just put a little bit more colour towards the top here to really get that apple moving over into the light. Catch that edge there. Do that a couple of times so you keep a nice smooth glaze through there. Going to use a little bit of that orangey pink and just reduce some of that highlight. Sweep through. Okay, just sit back, make sure that you can see all the areas that you've put the extra colour on, keeping them nice and soft as they dry. Okay, that's the last section which we're going to put glazes on. We'll come back in just a moment when they've settled. We're going to lift out a tiny little bit of paint now to get the little speckles on the top of the apple. And what you do is just wet the brush, get it to a nice point, and very gently, looking at the apple while you're doing it, just slightly agitate the paint with the tip of the brush. You leave a tiny little dot of water there as well, and just let it sit there for a few seconds, and then using a clean piece of kitchen towel, just lift the paint away, and that should give you a lovely little spot. So you need to do that in one or two places just to get some nice realism into the apple. So I'm just going to keep quiet now and finish putting all these little dots on. Once all those little spots are done, I can just add a little bit more detail to the top of the apple next to the stem. So I've got my stem colour that I mixed earlier, and I'm going to add a little bit of indigo to that. Twiddle your brush so you get a nice point, and put in a gentle, tiny amount of dark right into the centre there. And a nice little dark edge underneath the lip of the stalk. And a little bit of texture through the stalk as well. And I'm going to water that colour down and use that colour to just re-establish that shadow. Use the tip of the brush, be as exact as you can through there. And then a little bit of water just to soften it up into the highlight. And there we are, the finished apple portrait.
Now available to buy. Try these techniques at home whenever you wish. The DVD of today's workshop and the book that accompanies this series are now available to order from the Painting and Drawing channel. For further information and to order your copy, go to www.paintingdrawingchannel.com.